see that lone star from 1,000 miles away calling me.
Hello, and welcome to my presentation on Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck.
When I see that beacon shining for me all alone, it calls me back to
The main plot in Of Mice and Men consists of two characters, George and Lenny, and the adventures that they get around to. George is looking after Lenny and mistreats him a little. George and Lenny go to a farm where they're looking for work. They're looking for work so they can eventually raise enough money to buy their own farm and live off the fat of the land. Once they're at the farm, various things happen to them. There's this worker there called Curly. Curly has a wife who's described as a bit promiscuous, and she flirts around with the workers. Curly's wife starts to flirt with Lenny, and she lets Lenny touch her hair. Lenny gets a bit carried away and doesn't know what to do, so one thing leads to another, and Lenny ends up murdering her. It was an accident, but Curly won't see it that way. Lenny's very scared about the whole situation with Curly's wife, and he wants George to comfort him. George does comfort him, but when Lenny isn't looking, George shoots Lenny in the back of the head. George did this because he didn't want anyone else to lynch Lenny. George learned from Candy's example and didn't want someone else to shoot Lenny.
Lone Star shine.
In the beginning of the book, George is angry that he has to watch over Lenny, and he dreams of how if Lenny wasn't around, he could spend all day getting drunk, sleeping with prostitutes, and playing in ballrooms. One of the main concepts in Of Mice and Men is loneliness mixed with hedonism. One of the main concepts in Of Mice and Men is how all the workers are lonely. They have no purpose in life. All the workers besides George and Lenny work for a month, get their pay, and then go drink it all up or use the money to sleep with prostitutes. George and Lenny don't do this. They say that this is because they're friends. George and Lenny have a purpose. They want to buy their own farm. So they have a goal to work towards rather than short-term gratification once a month. John Steinbeck implies this idea of loneliness with one of the towns mentioned in the book, Soledad, which means solitude in Spanish. But in the end of the book, George loses Lenny and has no one to take care of. The last thing he says in the book is that he needs a drink. He mentions how he doesn't want to get his own farm anymore. He gives up his plan of getting his own land, and solemnly states how he plans to spend his money on prostitutes and pool rooms. George is now like all the other workers. He has no purpose, and he's indulging in short-term gratification.
Throughout the open range all round, sunlight and the smell of new morning.
Although George looks after Lenny, he's not a perfect caretaker. Before George and Lenny come to the farm, George used to physically abuse Lenny. He tricked him into jumping into streams, he beat him up, and he even commanded him to jump off of cliffs. During the events in Of Mice and Men, George is treating Lenny much better than he used to, although he still insults Lenny and doesn't stick up for Lenny after Curly attacks him. I have friends who are struggling in areas where I help them, just as I am helped by my friends in areas where I am struggling. When I'm responsible for my friends who are very bad at something I excel at, occasionally I will act like George, berating them and narcissistically describing how much better I am than them at what they are doing. Through reading Of Mice and Men, I'm aware of my negative actions when I'm responsible for others, and I now know that I need to improve this behavior. The most difficult thing about Of Mice and Men is the ending. It's a very anti-American ending because it ends with George giving up on his dreams. George realizes the value of his responsibility right as he loses it. It seems like George is going through an extreme low point. At the end of the book, there's no information given on if he's ever going to get out of this low point. It seems like George is going to engage in short-term gratification for the rest of his life, instead of working towards a long-term fulfilling goal like working towards land and responsibility. I find this very challenging. It's hard to digest.
Light my way.
The most valuable piece of insight that I learned is a quote from the stable buck in the story. He says, "A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't matter, no difference who the guy is." Responsibility for other people's growth will give me purpose. I have to maintain my personal life, and take some responsibility for my family and friends' growth. I need to use restraint when helping someone who is struggling. And I need to learn how to become a better caretaker.